Okay, so thanks everyone for coming today. My name is Ben Colbert. I'm reader in English literature at the University of Wolverhampton and the Deputy Director of the Center for Transnational and Transcultural Research. And this is another of our installment of the CTTR Research Seminar Series. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce my good colleague, Dr. Helen Davies, who's a senior lecturer here at Wolverhampton and our course leader as well in English literature. She's a specialist in Neo-Victorian literature and culture and disability studies, author of Gender and Ventriloquism in Victorian and Neo-Victorian Fiction in 2012, Neo-Victorian Freakery, the Cultural Afterlife of the Victorian Freak Show in 2015, and more recently, a collection, Comedy and the Politics of Representation, Mocking the Weak, co-edited with Sarah Lott. She has appeared on various BBC programs as an expert in Victorian popular culture, including Lucy Worsley's Victorian Secrets radio series. And her topic today is Down syndrome in Neo-Victorianism, victims, villains, and the problem of intelligence. Take it away, Helen.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you today. Okay, so I'm just going to share my slides now. Just bear with me a moment. I'm hoping that you can all see those. Now, the only issue with me sharing these slides is that I now can't see the chat or anything like that. So I won't be talking for the full hour, I hope. It should be about 45 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. So if you do have questions as I'm going along, please feel free to type in the chat and there'll be time for me to respond to those at the end. Okay then, so overview of the key points that I'm going to be talking through are on this first slide here. Now, with the quotations that I'm putting on these slides, I've referenced them briefly, but I haven't cluttered up the slides with the full references. So just to say, if you're interested in following up on any of the texts that I'm talking about, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I've put my email address and my Twitter handle on the first slide there as well. Okay, so I want to begin with a bit of an explanation for why I'm interested in this topic. So my late sister Elizabeth had Down syndrome, and when I was growing up, I was always baffled by people who would say to my parents, what a comfort it must be to them that children with Down syndrome are so happy and affectionate. So this was truly extraordinary to me, not least because my sister Elizabeth was just as reserved and cynical as the rest of my immediate family. And I've put some photographic evidence on the slide of me and my sister when we were children. You can tell that's the 90s from my outfit, can't you? But my point is this: if you spent any time around people with Down syndrome, you'd know that having an additional chromosome does not affect one's personality in any way. But where did this come from? Where did these ideas come from? It wasn't actually until, many years later, when I started looking at Victorian medical texts for other areas of my research, that the origins of this stereotype became apparent to me. So beginning with the work of John Langdon Down, and I'm going to say more on him in a bit, such writing includes sweeping statements that delineated fixed personality traits of people with Down syndrome. And I've just put some examples of this on the slide. So the first one is from a co-authored volume by John Fraser and Arthur Mitchell. And in this, Fraser is talking about a particular case study, a patient in his care who has Down syndrome. And he makes this comment: her chief characteristic was an affectionate disposition. This was evidenced by her kind, contented and happy expression. So that's just one patient, yeah? Mitchell, following up on this, did a collection of case studies talking about 62 people that were in their care. And he made the following comment: they would be also found to resemble each other in character, in capacity, in likings and dislikings, in habits, in defects and aptitudes, etc. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, W. Bertram Hill confidently asserted that people with Down syndrome, quote, are extremely good-tempered, cheerful and affectionate. And variations on this phrase would echo through medical textbooks for much of the 20th century, actually, and I'll say some more on that in a bit. So this offers an example, an opening example of how medical stereotypes about disability take on a social authority when they're repeated often enough. And also it demonstrates that the Victorians have a lot to answer for and, you know, in all sorts of ways, basically. So on that note, I think a definition of Neo-Victorianism might be useful for some of you as a context for what I'm going to be exploring today. So just very basically speaking, Neo-Victorian texts are late 20th, 21st century cultural productions. So this can be literature, film, television, etc., that are set in the Victorian era. But there's more to Neo-Victorianism than setting, okay? So this definition is from Heilmann and Llewellyn, and they define Neo-Victorianism in the following way. The Neo-Victorian is more than historical fiction set in the 19th century. Texts must be in some respect self-consciously engaged with the act of reinterpretation, rediscovery and revision concerning the Victorians. So, I mean, I'd add to this to say that, you know, any sort of historical fiction really is going to be self-conscious, that it's reinterpreting history in some way. But this definition is very useful and it's proved extremely influential, and it's been widely adopted by critics working in this field now. So one of the most compelling features of these revisionary impulses of Neo-Victorianism is in relation to social identities and attendant identity politics as well. So in contrast to a traditional narrative of history, which privileges white, cisgendered, heteronormative, perhaps upper to middle class, non-disabled subjects, Neo-Victorianism is invested in recentering those that have been neglected or marginalised from both factual and fictional accounts of the 19th century. So Neo-Victorian novels, for instance, routinely focus on characters, sometimes based on actual historical figures, sometimes imagined, that represent the others, if you will, of Victorian society. So this can include so-called mad women who have been unjustly confined to asylums because they're rebelling against patriarchal attitudes. This might include the voices of colonised people talking back to colonial oppressors. It might include freak show performers having their say on the terms of their exhibition. So I hope you get the general gist there of what Neo-Victorianism is doing. And in so many ways, I would say, the world that we live in today is still shaped by Victorian ideologies, traces of Victorian ideologies of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class and disability. So return to my opening comments about my sister Elizabeth. Those remarks, those, you know, ridiculous stereotypes and generalisations, they were being made in the 1980s and the 1990s. But actually, in even more recent times, even when I've mentioned my sister in academic circles, non-disability academic circles, studies academic circles, I hasten to add, people will make comparable remarks, which I'm sure are well-meaning, but they're demonstrating that certain Victorian ideologies about Down syndrome are still very much with us today. Okay, and you know, Quayson, writing from a disability studies perspective, identifies this as well. Certain present-day responses to disability, even among people presumably sharing an enlightened mode of thinking, still hark back to unexamined sentiments of a bygone era. So Neo-Victorianism in many ways has quite a precarious balancing act to perform. You know, it raises the question how to represent 19th century others without reiterating the same problematic cultural stereotypes, especially when some of us, in all sorts of ways, are still living lives that are shaped by the cultural weight of stereotypes which, you know, have originated in the Victorian era. And that's what, you know, I hope to demonstrate today. Actually, you know, this isn't an easy question to answer. But before I discuss some Neo-Victorian representations of Down syndrome, I want to say a little bit more about the 19th century constructions of Down syndrome to which Neo-Victorianism responds. And in the light of that, I want to give a content note, I suppose, not a warning, but a content note. The section that's to follow on this historical context is going to be quoting some concepts which are overtly disabilist and also racist as well. So, you know, I'll handle this sensitively, and I'll always be putting scare quotes around such vocabulary. I'm not entirely sure, because I can't see, whether you can see me at the moment. So if you can't see me doing the scare quotes around problematic vocabulary, please assume that I'll be doing that. Okay. Anyway, I'm sure that this history will be familiar to anybody in the audience who knows anything about the historical attitudes to Down syndrome and learning disability more broadly. But for those who are new to this history, please bear with me. And I hope the need for these reference points becomes apparent in terms of the analysis that I'll be offering when I get onto the Neo-Victorian texts. And just another note, due to the plots of the crime fiction novels are discussed, there are some brief references to sexual violence. I'm not going to dwell on these or go into gratuitous detail in any way, but I just want to flag up in advance that that will be mentioned. Okay then, so on to the Victorians. Brace yourself. So during the 19th century, the term idiocy, definitely always in scare quotes, is used as an umbrella medical definition to encompass a very wide range of cognitive disabilities and differences as well. So David Wright, he identifies that medical discourse in Western Europe in the first half of the 19th century invested in idiocy as a condition which had the potential to be improved in some way via education. And so from the 1840s onwards, specialist institutions for the so-called treatment of idiocy were being established in Europe and North America. And Wright makes the point that, in his terms, these were distinct from the public lunatic asylum, which was the vocabulary for talking about mental health of the day. Okay, so although that emphasis on education might seem progressive to us, it also actually represents the beginnings of a formal process of the segregation of people with learning disabilities from participation in mainstream society. Furthermore, as Leonard J. Davis has argued, the period of around the 1840s in the Victorian era is notable for the introduction of the concept of the normal or the norm into European vocabularies. Okay, and it's this idea that the norm is about conforming, not deviating or differing, a common type, standard, usual, regular, that sort of thing. Okay. And that has ideological consequences, doesn't it? For alongside a new emphasis on the significance of scientific statistics and standards for establishing the so-called normal body and mind, that becomes the discursive, the discursive construction of the abnormal other. Okay, the abnormal other. So the problem of disability is constructed in this period. So the ramifications of this redefinition or definition of the boundaries between the normal and the abnormal are probably all too familiar. Okay, the second half of the Victorian era influenced by the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 and the later publication, The Descent of Man, in 1871. This period is typified excuse me, by an increasing anxiety about the potential for degeneration. The idea that evolution might work in reverse. The idea that certain people, certain subjects, so this is people of colour, disabled people, the poor, and so-called sexual deviants and criminals, might be further down the evolutionary chain than others. So, John Langdon Down, he is writing at this very historical moment. So whilst he was working as the medical superintendent of the Earlswood Asylum in Surrey between 1858 and 1868, he identified shared physical characteristics of a group of patients in his care. And he published a paper which is entitled Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. So in this, he coins the concept of, and I'm quoting this and definitely scare quotes, the Mongolian type of idiocy. This terminology, as I say, this disableist, this racist terminology, persisted in various forms until a collective of scientists in the 1960s petitioned for the name of the condition, now understood to be chromosomal and not hereditary, as was thought in the Victorian era, to be changed. However, it should be noted here that what I call the M word is still in general circulation in medical circles in the 1980s. My mother's actually told me that that expression was used by some doctors talking to her about my sister, and it has a painful afterlife as a derogatory insult even today. Yeah, the legacies of the Victorians are still with us. So Langdon Down's publication is making a transparent connection between learning disability and racialised categorisation, and it's loaded with implications of supposed racial inferiority of his subjects to white, Western, non-disabled subjects as well. And of course, such medical texts would give rise to eugenics, the eugenic theories of commentators such as Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. So the relationship of degeneration theory to imperial fantasies of white European racial superiority, and indeed the supposed moral dubious of the poor and the criminal classes and the disabled closer to home, is well documented. And as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, norms of gender and sexuality also become integral to deciding which bodies, and indeed minds, are considered to be fit for reproduction. So it's crucial that we recognise that the concept of intelligence and its vague, though evocative, other idiocy also underpins this investment in the identification and classification of social deviance. Although the establishment of specialist educational homes for those deemed so-called, idiots might have originated as a mission of care and edification inspired by Christian charity, Lindsay Brigham highlights a developing emphasis by the end of the 19th century on, which emphasised the idiot, and I'm quoting here, as subhuman, an object of fear and dread and a threat to society. Okay. So this idea is representing the eugenicist fear of the reproduction of cognitive difference, now coded as deviant and menacing the healthiness of European populations. Thus, by the end of the 19th century, the proper place, the so-called proper place for learning disability, was now considered to be the secure institution. And this was framed as for the protection of the general public in mainstream discourse. Okay, so you don't need me to tell you, this is a deeply troubling history. And based on what I was saying about Neo-Victorianism in my introduction, it seems ripe for a Neo-Victorian re-evaluation or intervention. And perhaps unsurprisingly, characters with Down syndrome do feature in Neo-Victorianism. And I think it's important that this has tended to be within the genre of Neo-Victorian crime fiction as well. So I hope the reason for that really unpleasant historical context that I've just been giving to you is now becoming apparent. If Victorian medicine aligned learning disability with potentially criminal deviance, then surely Neo-Victorian crime fiction is ideally placed to challenge and reimagine such stereotypes. And at first glance, this sometimes does appear to be the case. So let me give you an example. Karen Charlton's The Sculthorpe Murder, which was published in 2016. So that is set in early 19th century Leicestershire, so actually a bit before the Victorian era, and I'll say something on that in a moment. So Detective Lavender is the central detective in this, and he's called upon to investigate the murder of a man named William Scunthorpe that seems to have been witnessed by his son Billy, who is a character with Down syndrome. Okay. So although both Lavender and his assistant have very disableist assumptions about Billy's credibility, both in terms of his cognitive ability to act as a witness and his general trustworthiness, Billy actually emerges as offering important information for the investigation. And, you know, he's an interesting character in lots of ways. So in this sense, the detective's assumptions about so-called idiocy are being quite satisfactorily challenged. So far, so very Neo-Victorian. However, despite the fact this is set earlier in the century, before the Victorian era, the twists of the plot line of this novel rest on very Victorian anxieties about hereditary degeneracy. So it transpires that Billy in the novel is actually the first son of a local aristocratic family, and he's heir to a fortune as well. But that this family faked Billy's death when he was born so that the integrity of the family line wouldn't be compromised. So although the characterisation of Billy, I would say, is sympathetic and it emphasises his individual capabilities, in various ways he's still trapped within what I would refer to as a eugenic plotline. I'll say more about that a bit later on. Furthermore, there are obviously some issues to do with temporality here, a kind of temporal collapsing of lots of ideas about, you know, kind of 19th century disability and modern ideas about disability as well. And Rosario Arias, you know, talks about this in relation to Neo-Victorian representations of disability more broadly. She says how they, and I quote, simultaneously look backwards to how disability was depicted in Victorian literature and culture, and forwards to how current and future cultural interventions into disability studies have an effect upon and penetrate fiction writing. Okay. What we see here then is that there's a real blending going on of this early 19th century setting, late Victorian eugenic anxieties, and a 21st century, very Neo-Victorian self-consciousness about needing to challenge stereotypes of disability, but still invoking them in some ways. So this is even more pronounced when we get onto Neo-Victorian texts that are set later in the 19th century. And now I want to focus on Amanda Taylor's novel, Dangerous Waves, which was published in 2015. So let me just tell you a little bit about it. It's set in 1897 in North Yorkshire in a village called Staithes. And the novel focuses on the case of Daniel Robertshaw. He is a teenaged man with Down syndrome, the son of a local widow, and he has been falsely accused of murdering a young woman. He actually just found the body of this young woman on the beach. So James Cairn, who is a barrister, he's the kind of main protagonist of the novel, and he's also an amateur fossil collector. He takes up the case on Daniel's behalf. So Cairn is a man whose profession is defined by conventional understandings of intelligence. His interest in fossil hunting leads to a meeting with Daniel. So Daniel directs him to a fossilized ichthyosaur, which he's found in the rocks on the beach. Now, this subplot, coupled with Cairn's admission that he is a, quote, confirmed Darwinist, should give us pause for thought, I think, particularly given the historical context I offered to you earlier. It seems telling to me that Cairn is digging, quote, reveling in the primitive smell of clay when Daniel first appears. So what we see here is that the character with Down syndrome is instantly aligned with atavism, being, this kind of idea of a throwback to an earlier time. And also the Victorian symbolism of the ichthyosaur is important here. Now, the Victorians were very interested in dinosaurs, and this fascination would soon also become conflated with ideologies of degeneration. So, in David Sapolsky's terms, and I quote from him here, the stories a society tells itself about the fates of extinct prehistoric creatures have as much to do with that society's beliefs and values about the world as they do with the past. For the Victorians and their immediate descendants, dinosaurs were emblematic of the fate of all of those who were unable to keep pace with a changing world and must therefore stand aside for those who could. So, given the Darwinian context of such ideologies, it's also significant, I think, that the ichthyosaur was represented, albeit satirically, as notably unintelligent in a poem by Mary Kendall, which was called The Ballad of the Ichthyosaur, and this was published in Punch magazine in 1885, and it is satirical. Okay. The brain of the ichthyosaur was never a patch on his eye. It owned no supreme constitution, was shallow and simple and plain, while mark but the fair convolution and size of the Aryan brain. My goodness, yes. So the reference to the Aryan brain here is also evidently invoking the racist constructions of idiocy that I was discussing previously. And it's important, I think, that in James Cairns's mind, after that he's met Daniel, Daniel becomes conflated with this extinct creature as well. So Cairn dreams of Daniel after he's met him, Daniel and the ichthyosaur. And, I'm quoting from the novel here, the child man of Staithes was suddenly thrown into shadow, dwarfed by a Jurassic monster. Now, I'll be commenting on the infantilization of Daniel here a little bit later on. But at this juncture, the concept of Daniel being in the shadow of the dinosaur speaks to Victorian notions of the survival of the fittest. Both dinosaurs and people with Down syndrome, it is implied, may not be clever enough to avoid extinction. Now, quite poignantly, I feel, Daniel himself seems to internalise such a view. When he is accused of murder, the narrative voice reflects, quote, Daniel did not want to take a step further, wanted to be fixed in stone himself. This life was too painful. Okay. But the neo-Victorian knowledge we bring to these textual themes is perhaps even more sinister. My point being here that I think eugenic concerns aren't limited to the Victorian era. Clearly, they cast a long shadow into the 20th century, most notoriously, of course, with the Nazi Germany, the final solution, but also, practices of enforced sterilisation and institutionalisation that were in play in Britain Britain and the US well into the, the late 20th century as well. And furthermore, I mean, and forgive me for dwelling on something, so very horrible, really. But some of the most disturbing news stories, there were so many, that came out of the first wave of the pandemic was these stories told of the do not resuscitate notices being attached without consent to COVID patients with learning disabilities and indeed other cognitive differences as well. We should also not forget the experiences of many, many women and people who tell of it being assumed by the medical profession that when Down syndrome is detected in their pregnancy, advice about termination will be absolutely necessary. Now, I want to make it really, really clear here. I make no criticism whatsoever of women who are choosing termination under any circumstances. This should be an inalienable right. My target here, though, my criticism here is about a medical profession that still considers Down syndrome is and I put this in scare quotes, a severe disability that's worthy of special mention as a candidate for late term termination. Okay, so when the dead girl on the beach is discovered, the Staithes community very quickly jumped to the conclusion that Daniel must be the murderer. They subsequently torch his, and there's no reason offered for this other than the fact that he's marked as different in his community. So these villagers, they subsequently torch his mother's cottage, and Daniel is arrested and he's removed to languish in jail pretty much for the rest of the novel's plot until he makes his court appearance. Okay. So it transpires that this dead girl on the beach is Estelle. She is the missing daughter of a local aristocrat, a gentleman named Sir Hugh Park, and Estelle has actually been hidden away from birth on account of her albinism. Okay, So it also transpires in the novel, in a post-mortem examination, that Estelle was pregnant when she died, and hence Daniel is accused of being a sexual predator alongside a murderer. So the threat of hereditary deviance is surely raising its head again in this formulation. Daniel's disability is linked to moral degeneracy. The prosecution at his trial makes the following statement, and I quote, "Though the prisoner's diminished intellect is apparent to everyone, you must bear in mind that he has the body and desires of an adult man. And without any regard for the social proprieties, those desires can turn into the lust of a beast." Okay, so again, Down syndrome and purported lack of intelligence are associated with animality, basically subhumanity, and sexual menace as well. However, the star witness at Daniel's trial challenges this narrative. Now, we've learned from Daniel's mother earlier in the novel that actually Daniel himself was the victim of a sexual assault by some local sisters, from another family, but some sisters who were older than him. So Grace Malaby, who is one of these sisters, who is now married, has been brought to the court by Khan to testify. So she explains that at this time she was pregnant without being married, and that she wanted to find, in her terms, an easy conquest to blame for this existing illegitimate pregnancy. So, the girls set upon Daniel, essentially. But it emerges, and she tells everybody this in court, that Daniel is impotent. Okay, that's how it's described in the novel. She uses some quite choice expressions to relate that, which I won't repeat. But here's a bit of what she says. "Iced fish from Greenland have more life to him than he. Believe me, mister, me and my sisters tried every trick we knew." Right, well, So Daniel is transformed from villain to victim, and the case very rapidly unravels. Of course, it's reassuring from a neo-Victorian point of view that the novel does not participate in that moral degeneracy trope when representing Victorian learning disability. But I ask the question, does Daniel's, impotency, perhaps inadvertently, still depend on this eugenic plotting that I mentioned before? Actually, that he cannot reproduce is framed as a cause for relief in the novel. And furthermore, Grace Malaby's fishy comparison here reiterates the connection between Daniel and the extinct fossilised fish. As an only child, he is the end of the Robertson line, and his apparent lack of adult sexuality also infantilises him. It should be noted here that infantilising attitudes towards learning disabled adults are still rife in our contemporary society and culture. So, the conclusion at the end of the novel is that the unborn child of Estelle was actually the product of incestuous sexual abuse. This child was fathered by Estelle's aristocratic father, and that he actually murdered his own daughter to cover his crime. So, very unpleasant. But how interesting that there is an echo here of Charlton's eugenic aristocratic plotline in the Sculthorpe murder. We should also remember Estelle's own physical difference in the form of albinism, which can be hereditary, when interpreting what this actually means. Within the world of the novel, the reproduction of disability is either impossible or criminal, and either way it needs to be terminated. Okay, so just on to the last bit now. I haven't got long to go. So in the concluding part of this paper, I want to draw some of these strands of my analysis together to make some more general comments, I suppose, about the role of Down syndrome in neo-Victorian crime fiction in particular. So I think, based on the evidence I've presented to you today, Neo-Victorianism's interest in progressive identity politics does not, in the case studies I've offered here, wholly extend to representations of Down syndrome. Actually, had I selected other examples, I would have, been coming to very similar conclusions as well. And, I'm thinking this through at the moment. I'm doing some further work on this. But could it be that there is something about Neo-Victorianism as a genre, as a cultural mode of representing the past, which tends towards privileging certain forms of intelligence or knowledge over others? And when we're talking about intelligence and its eugenic heritage, but its eugenic past in lots of ways, it's always a loaded concept. Okay. So, Anne Heilmann and Mark Llewellyn, I mentioned them before. In their study of Neo-Victorianism, they highlight divided readership. So they acknowledge that actually Neo-Victorianism is very much part of popular culture, as well as the being sort of what they refer to as higher end literary fiction in the genre as well. And they talk about this division between what they call the ordinary reader and the knowledgeable reader in Neo-Victorianism. And by the knowledgeable reader, they tend to mean the critical reader, the academic reader in that sense. And they say that in lots of ways, when it comes to the kind of metafictional games, that knowingness that Neo-Victorianism presents, that it's actually the knowledgeable reader that's privileged in Neo-Victorianism. So Marie-Louise Kohlke has actually cautioned against just canonising the more literary, high cultural texts of Neo-Victorianism. She says that, there's this sense that we can be quite exclusionary, I suppose, if we only look at what we believe is sophisticated texts in Neo-Victorianism, that is high culture readers, she says. And Jessica Cox, she's done some really, recent invaluable work on this. So, she talks about neo-sensation fiction, and she makes the point that neo-Victorian criticism has tended to laud the literary over the popular. And, she makes this quote here: much also depends on the reader. The critical academic reader approaches a text in a different manner to the general reader, whose primary aim may be entertainment or diversion. The meaning of a text, then, is dependent on the reader's ability to interpret it. Okay. So Cox's stressing of the ability of the reader here is key. To reformulate this slightly, I think Neo-Victorianism has inclined towards valuing certain types of knowledge, intellectual, academic, over others. Okay, so just towards my last slide now, I'm heading towards the end. So Patrick McDonagh begins his cultural history of idiocy by observing that there's been a tendency to consider the so-called idiot as, quote, a resilient contrast group, a category of people against whom we rational modern and postmodern folk can identify ourselves, to affirm our intelligence and to assert our claims to respect and justice. Okay, so what I'm arguing basically is actually characters with Down syndrome in Neo-Victorianism kind of function in a similar way as well, both within the text but also metatextually outside of the text. Just as Daniel's childlike perception of the world becomes the other by which to define the more sophisticated characters and the more, conventionally intellectual characters in the novel, so does Neo-Victorian criticism assume an unquestioned concept of intelligence or knowledge in terms of accounts of the genre and its readership. And, just to go back to the crime fiction aspect that I've been talking about, detectives, in Victorian crime fiction are invariably defined by their intelligence, yeah? Think of Poe's Dupin, obviously Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. These are, demonstrably, conventionally intelligent men in all sorts of ways. So, the characters with learning disability are always potentially going to have a difficult time being the other to that conventional intelligence. So going back to Jess Cox for a moment, she's identified that detective fiction and Neo-Victorian detective fiction does tend to belong to the realms of popular culture. But she also makes the point that actually the whole sort of drive of Neo-Victorianism, this interest in uncovering and solving the mysteries of the past, is actually like a mode of detective fiction writ large. So my point being that even the so-called ordinary or average reader of the Neo-Victorian crime novel is being invited to align themselves with the allegedly superior intelligence of the detective rather than other characters, in particular characters that are marked out as having a learning disability as well. Okay, I'm acutely aware of the irony of my critique of privileged knowledge and intelligence in the light of being an academic working within higher education, a system which historically is founded on and in some ways continues to, and I quote from Tim Dolmage here, accentuate ability, valorise perfection and stigmatise anything that hints at intellectual weakness. However, my exploration today of the politics of Neo-Victorian representations of learning disability and the wider ramifications for the politics of the genre is an attempt to expose that which we might take for granted as scholars in the field. The alternative identities and knowledges we might subjugate, and at what cost. I think we must not become complacent that society has moved on from Victorian discourses of eugenics. Neo-Victorian cultural productions and scholarship is well placed to be attuned to the cultural afterlife of 19th century regimes of normalcy with regards to gender, sexuality, ethnicity and class. We omit disability from these category of identities at our peril. And there we go. Thank you very much for listening. And that is, oh, right, stop presenting. There we go. And I'm back on screen. Hi. Thanks very much. And I think there's, how am I doing for time? Yeah, okay, plenty of time, I think, for questions, if anybody's got any. I'm just getting the chat up here as well. Oh, dear, microphones were echoing. I was gloriously oblivious to that. I do apologise, everybody. Okay, so yeah, any questions, comments? Please feel free to put your mics on if you're comfortable, or you can type in the chat instead as well. Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you. Thanks for coming along. Thanks, Grace. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I'd just like to say, Helen, that was a wonderfully argued paper.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
It was a pleasure to hear, and certainly it warns us against becoming too complacent with seeing Neo-Victorian fiction as a kind of privileged space of critique. I'm just kind of interested, if I may interject with a question in a way, is that especially the first text that you mentioned, which plays fast and easy with even Victorian history, kind of melding Victorian ideas onto a kind of earlier period. Do you think that the Neo-Victorian fiction also engages in a kind of homogenization of history? And especially in terms of disability, I was thinking in an earlier disability text like William Wordsworth's The Idiot Boy, published in Lyrical Ballads, which takes a much different approach to disability and to Down syndrome in particular, than the post-eugenics models of disability. And yet this text kind of collapses the earlier notions with later notions, and and kind of reconfigures the past as the position of contemporary knowledge versus a position of homogenized past.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Ben. And yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's a really pertinent insight. I mean, one of the sort of criticisms of Neo-Victorianism, particularly in the earlier days of the genre, I think the mode, I should say, I think people have got more, kind of used to the tricks that Neo-Victorianism, the postmodern tricks that Neo-Victorianism plays, was this idea about a sort of collapsing of boundaries and, historical detail and flagrant rewriting and historical inaccuracies. And there are ethical issues with that. I mean, when the target of that sort of, as I say, fast and loose, rewriting of history is those impositions of power, perhaps we can see it as part of that revisionary impulse and having, a sort of, a politically progressive import in that respect. But I think when it comes to disability, and I mean, I could say plenty about this, it's not just learning disability or cognitive difference that's, a bit lagging behind in terms of representation in Neo-Victorianism. Disability more broadly, it's physical disability generally speaking. And I know I've got some of my students here that were in the MA class on Neo-Victorianism, and they'll know about this because we talked about this quite a bit. Actually, they do tend towards being quite limited, trading perhaps a lot more on generalised Victorian stereotypes than, in relation to other kind of identities, which are genuinely doing more interesting things. So I think there is a sort of, if I can use the words of Quayson again here, who I quoted earlier, an aesthetic nervousness when it comes to disability in Neo-Victorianism that does need to be taken to task a little bit more. I think, in some ways. But thank you for the question, Ben. Oh, sorry, Ben, you're on mute.
No, just to say there's a question in the chat from
oh, hello, let's have a look. I'll have a look at the chat. Thank you everybody for your lovely comments. Sarah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your kind comments. I really appreciate that. As someone who also has a sibling with Downs, how do you place yourself within your research? Do you find your bias allows for an alternative view, or do you aim to remain objective and separate yourself from the research that you do? Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for sharing that about your sibling as well. And it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, you know, Elizabeth was older than me, so I grew up around disability, you know, all of my childhood, and actually for many years it was too personal for me to work on this topic. I kind of came across disability studies when I was doing some postgraduate study and was fascinated by it, but thought, I can't do this, you know, this is too personal, it's too personal. But actually, I think with things that are happening in society and what I perceive to be, you know, still really problematic attitudes towards Down syndrome in particular, I really felt that it was important to do some kind of research on this, particularly in a literary context, and following the sort of disability studies tradition. And if you read disability studies, you know, you'll come across this kind of announcing one's own investment in a topic is actually quite you know, standard within the field in lots of ways. That positionality is quite important, and I think in some ways, you know, it does give us when we have these experiences, either, you know, lived experience of disability, either ourselves or a family member, it does give us different insights. And I don't know, I guess it's from the kind of my own critical position in lots of ways. I think we can never be wholly objective in lots of ways. So yeah, you know, it is quite subjective, that the work that I do, and I think I have to be quite careful sometimes to sort of rein my anger in as well. That's something I need to work on with it in some ways, because it is difficult, you know, as I'm sure you know yourself, when you're coming from this with personal knowledge and you're coming across, you know, kind of offensive attitudes and stereotypes. So thank you very much for that question, Sarah. There's a question here from George. Hi, George. Thank you. So George asking how similar this is from how Neo-Victorianism treats other kinds of otherness. Yeah, so I sort of more or less answered that before, but yeah, you know, I would say, I think there's a real issue with disability in Neo-Victorianism, particularly, you know, physical disability. I think that there has been some, you know, kind of work done on that, but you know, cognitive difference more broadly, and particularly learning disability, has really been critically neglected. Plenty of studies on mental illness in Neo-Victorianism. As I said before, the so-called Victorian madwoman is a perennial favourite, but not so much at all on characters with learning disability. And it's often something that people in the field get a little bit, I don't want to say upset, but can be a bit defensive if you point it out in some ways as well. Okay, but part of the research that I want to do is sort of bring this a bit more, to get people thinking about it a bit more, and as a starting point for other people in that way. So I hope that answers your question, George, and thanks very much. Thanks, Christy, thanks so much for coming. And yeah, this is completely what we were talking about in lots of ways this morning in our seminar, wasn't it? Thank you, Belle, thank you for your lovely comment there. Chelsea, thank you. Saying here, I've found several of the Neo-Victorian novels I've read recently still tend to fall into the trap of depicting any kind of learning disability as less than. Yeah, Chelsea, I completely agree. We should exchange notes on that, because I'm always trying to get kind of more examples of this. But I think you're completely right. This isn't just about Down syndrome, is it? It's about you know, a wide spectrum of learning disabilities. Do you think there is a lagging between successful interpretations of physical otherness and mental otherness? Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of reiterating the point that I'd made before. I really do. And I think it is this anxiety either anxiety about how learning disability should be presented, or, I'm sorry to say, just ignorance. Just ignorance. You know, this idea about stereotypes that are still in circulation, as I started off my paper by saying. So there's so much work that's still to be done. I do think there's a sense that, you know, Neo-Victorian examples which incorporate, say, adaptations, actors with Down syndrome, they're really leading the field in this. So, for example, there was an adaptation of Charles Dickens's Barnaby Rudge, which features a kind of, I'll put that in scare quotes, an idiot character, and that in 2014, I think it was on Radio 4, and the wonderful Daniel Laurie, who is an actor with Down syndrome, played that role, which I thought was a wonderful way of sort of, you know, acknowledging the sort of learning disability in Neo-Victorianism, but actually representing that, having Daniel Laurie represent himself in that way, I think was really valuable and really important. And I'd like to see more of that sort of thing in Neo-Victorianism as well. Oh dear, sorry, I've got too many questions here. Oh, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you. We should talk ichthyosaurs some more, because I know you're interested in fossils. And I completely agree. The COVID hangover, and the COVID attitudes to COVID was a terrible sort of reminder that some of these eugenic values have not left us in all sorts of ways. Daisy, as someone who adapts often racist, misogynistic medieval texts, we're interested in your discussion of time problems with modern novelists writing Neo-Victorian novels. Is it possible to write historical fiction without just reproducing ableist attitude? Yeah, this is such an interesting question, Daisy. Or is this an area where we still have authors thinking uncritically about how they construct these characters and attitudes? Great question, and thank you so much. And both, I would say, both. I think it is difficult. So I'll draw on the example of, Down syndrome. What you often get in representations of Down syndrome in Neo-Victorianism is they'll be using the M word, they'll be using other deeply offensive vocabulary. And then there's an author's note, either at the start or at the end, which says, hey, this has been in a couple of books. Karen Charlton does this, although she doesn't use the M word. But, makes this is in a couple of the books about outdated terminology, but it reflects the views of the time. Which I think is a way of doing it. I'm not entirely sure always how successful that is, because sometimes Neo-Victorianism, and this kind of goes back to Ben's initial question, I suppose, has a tendency to represent Victorian attitude, Victorian ideologies as hegemonic or hegemonic. I'm never quite sure how to say it. Like everybody was racist or everybody thought this way. And, that clearly wasn't the case in all sorts of ways. Do you know what I mean? You can find historical evidence in the archives of people challenge. I haven't found anything on Down syndrome just yet, but I will keep looking. But in relation to other disabilities, people challenging these narratives in various ways. Ideologies are never totalizing. And so in a way, there's a kind of sense in Neo-Victorianism of like a hyper, a hyper representation of Victorian dreadfulness, and it's Victorian problematic ideologies, and it's almost like this attempt to emphasize the dreadfulness of Victorian views, which we can then kind of congratulate ourselves that we've moved on from this. I actually think that the most interesting Neo-Victorian texts are the ones which are self-consciously making those connections about the commonalities, the ways in which these legacies are still with us in some ways. And to be fair to both of these authors that I was talking about, I think they are aware of that, and I think they're doing that in some ways. I think it just comes down to the deeper implications. That's something, you know, there's perhaps more work to be done, but I hope that answers your question, Daisy, and thank you. Sorry, I'm very, very conscious that we're just about at 2 o'clock, but that was the last question. Yeah. So good. Okay.
Sorry, that was a great place to end on, and I'd just like to thank you again, Helen, so much for such a fascinating talk with huge ramifications, and we look forward to seeing what more work you produce on this. I'd like to also thank all of you for turning up today and for and such excellent questions as well, and not to mention Jason for setting up this scene behind the scenes and for all the work that you've done. So thanks again to everyone, and particularly join me to thank Helen one last time for a truly wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everybody, and thank you for your wonderful questions and supportive comments as well. So appreciated. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Thanks so much. Bye. Thanks everybody. Bye.